Welcome everyone to our 395 Fellows discussion. It's called Voices from Public Service. We have three incredible people for you to learn from here. I have a couple of 395 announcements before we get started. This is part of our professional development series. For y'all, you have to attend 2 of those to get course credit. And we have another one that we added. It's a voter registration workshop on April 12th. So if you need one more, it's there on the calendar. Reach out to me if you have any questions. But for our audience, my name is Nicole Pompilio. I am the Student Programs Manager here at the Center for the Political Future. And I'm very, very excited to have our 3 guests today. First, we have Todd Purdum. He's a former New York Times reporter and staff writer for The Atlantic. Ralph Neas, the former Executive Director of the Leadership Conference of Civil and Human Rights. And then we also have Amy Turk. She's a social worker and the CEO of the Downtown Women's Center. And our students are going to learn a little bit about careers and sort of their roles in public service today. So Ben and I have a couple questions for you, and then we're going to open it up to the students so that they can ask their questions. But I want to just start with sort of telling us a little bit about yourself and your history for our students that haven't met you. And Amy, we can start with you.
Thanks. Nice to be together. I think it was instilled in me of a life of service growing up, and I saw my parents do that in action in so many different ways, and just kind of knew I wanted to be in a helping profession. And my only concept of that was to be a therapist at the time. And I came out from Colorado to college at Pepperdine and signed up for a psychology major, and then gravitated more to the sociology side though, when I started thinking about a person in their environment and less about a person one-on-one. And that was informed by the requirement to volunteer in just about every single class that I took as an intern or some type of service learning component. And in my women's studies class, the professor had been volunteering at a shelter for women in Santa Monica. And I went with her one night, and they assumed we knew how to cook, which was a bad assumption to make, but somehow we pulled off making a meal for the 15 women that lived there. And I sat down and had a meal with a woman who was in her 60s, who shared her reasons that she felt she had experienced homelessness, and she was just right on the cusp of getting her keys and moving into a new home. I was just really impressed with her. And that whole experience made me keep coming back to that social service where I volunteered throughout my whole time at college. And then just got more interested in like the policy side, politics, how systems impact people. And then I just stayed there. They hired me as night staff my senior year. I did quit for a moment, and I worked for the Public Interest Research Group, the PIRGs. And they sent me off to Boston for 2 weeks of political and community organizing training. And I love the training, but it didn't feel like me. And the concept was they'd send you anywhere into the nation, and you'd run a community organizing campaign for whatever cause. And I made them send me back to Los Angeles, and I ran an office where they go deploy the people that go ask you to sign things or go door to door and ask for money for various causes, but it just wasn't like my heart. My heart was in the social work side, and turns out the place that I was volunteering at had never even worked at, never took me off payroll. And I called them and I was like, hey, are there any jobs open? And they looked at payroll and they're like, you're still on the rolls here, which was poor HR administration at the time, but they had me back, and that grew my career in social work. So case manager, managed the shelter, directed them the programs for women. And 9 years ago, I moved over to the Downtown Women's Center as the chief program officer. Right before that, I completed a master's in social work and became a licensed clinical social worker. And I've been at Downtown Women's Center for the last 9 years. The last 2, which corresponds with COVID, I've been the CEO. So that has been an interesting CEO start.
Ralph?
Let me start by saying what a fortunate individual you're looking at right now, and a grateful individual. I'm a product of the 60s, but perhaps not in the way some people would have considered the 60s type person. I grew up in a conservative Catholic family, and my dad was a Goldwater supporter. I became a Nelson Rockefeller liberal Republican, which, by the way, contrary to anything on my resume, here, I remained until I was 50 years old. And during the 1960s, I was a liberal, especially on civil rights. Martin Luther King and many of the people I would subsequently meet when I got into civil rights issues. During the height of the Vietnam War, I was a lieutenant colonel of the ROTC. And my roommate was the drum major for the Notre Dame Fighting Irish Band. This is good to tell you USC students, right? I can feel the warmth alone. He turned out to be the leader of Sane Nuclear Freeze, the national international movement against nuclear war. And of course, I turned out eventually to be the CEO of the lobbying arm of the civil rights movement, which I did for 15 years. I was very fortunate after law school at the University of Chicago and the Army to become Senator Edward W. Brooks' chief counsel. And then after that, I became a candidate for the CEO slot at the Leadership Conference. And I learned a very valuable lesson at the consummate meeting when the decision was made. I knew I was a candidate, so I knew that I might have a chance to win. And I did, but I wasn't a consensus candidate because one of the leading Black civil rights leaders in the country said, "We all love you, Ralph, and you did great work with Senator Brooke. But Ralph, as far as I'm concerned, you're 0 for 4, white male Republican and Catholic." And I said, "Thanks for your honesty." But it was a tremendous moment in the most positive way, because from that moment on, my whole job perspective changed. My purpose in life was to work on civil rights, equal opportunity for everybody, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. But all of a sudden I realized I was representing these 200 organizations of all the minority groups, women's groups, disability groups, labor groups, across the board, the lobbying arm of the civil rights movement. And I would have to look at things a little bit differently, listen a little bit closer to what people were saying, make sure the diversity, the equity, the inclusiveness was there. And then I ran for office and finished second. Joe Trippi, as I told you, our speaker this morning, was my campaign manager. And then Norman Lear called up and said, "Would you like to be president and CEO of People for the American Way?" And I said, "That sounds like a great job, especially after the last year or two." And I did that for 8 years. And then did some work in affordable medicine and work that followed up on what I had done. I discussed the Americans with Disabilities Act and fair housing and lots of things like that. And then I did affordable medicine after the Affordable Care Act, taking on Big Pharma. And I want to close a mini summary, for me anyway, right? This hasn't been too long. And just underscore everything that I've been saying in terms of purpose and what's important to me in my life on 2 separate occasions, as recently as the last several years. And my colleagues have heard bits of this anyway. I came down with something called Guillain-Barré syndrome, which left me totally paralyzed on a ventilator, total of 500 days in hospital beds and 80 days on ventilators. I bring it up because it's really important to my career and my personal life. What matters? At that key moment, some of you have heard this, 2 years ago, and the doctor came in and I had my 5th relapse. And I had just learned how to walk again and woke up paralyzed for the 5th time in 5 months. And the doctor comes in and says, "You're going to live." And I said, "Tell me why." Tell me how. And he said, "Because you have purpose. I've known you a long time, and I know you want to get back." to doing the kinds of things we've been talking about in my class, to do the things I was doing on the Voting Rights Act this year and the filibuster. But he also said, unlike the first time in 1979, 1980, you have a child, who, by the way, is probably going to USC, not Notre Dame, next year to be a graduate student. And then Katie, my wife, just became the assistant secretary for special education at the Department of Education. So I share that in somewhat of a concise way to give you some sense of what I've done, but why I've done it, and hopefully continue to do it, as well as the three of us trying to share our experiences, our perspective, our expertise, because for two of the three people that we send at the table, we're going to be active for a long time, but it's also the time in life when you start sharing with the next generations. And this is why I said yes to Bob Schrum and Mike Murphy, and yes to all of you. And hopefully it's the beginning of another phase of my career without abandoning a lot of the things I've been doing.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks. I grew up in a small farming town in Illinois. My family had lived for multiple generations and we're all Republicans. I had pursued journalism from really my earliest days in elementary school. I was the editor of my 6th grade school newspaper, but I didn't know anybody who was a writer, or I didn't really have any sense of imagination to think about how you might be able to make a living as a writer. So I think I grew up going through high school and college thinking I wanted to be a lawyer. But it dawned on me that most lawyers don't get to fight on the side of the angels the way Ralph has, or be Atticus Finch, and most lawyers have to just do what their clients want, and it's a kind of a grim, grinding job. So in college, I had the campus correspondent for the New York Times when I was at Princeton. And when I got out of college in 1982, in the middle of a recession, I think I applied to, I'm trying to remember how I found all the addresses of these places, but I think I applied to about 130 newspapers, and one, they all said, come back when you have 3 to 5 years experience and apply again. And my only question was, how would I get the 3 to 5 years experience if I had to? So I was offered ultimately a job at a small paper in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania called the Bethlehem Globe Times. And it was an afternoon paper, which even then there weren't very many left of. And the job would have been getting up at 5 in the morning and going there and matching the competition of the neighboring town in the Allentown Morning Call. And it just seemed really, it was a dying steel town at the time, and it just seemed like a depressing thing. So halfway through my 2-week tryout, the crusty editor who had won a Pulitzer Prize for editorial writing offered me the job. And I said, oh, Mr. Stromer, I'm so complimented, but I really can't take it. I have to keep looking. And he said, okay, well then, I'm sorry, but work out the rest of your 2-week tryout. And then I said, no, I have to leave today. If I'm going to tell you, no, I can't stay for another week. And he said, but you made a deal to work for 2 weeks. I said, you didn't tell me you're going to hire me halfway through. So it was very painful. And I think I was telling my son the other day that if I'd gone to bed and had to think about it, I probably wouldn't have had the courage to go in there and tell him that I had to leave right then. So ultimately I went to the New York Times, where I was hired as a copy boy and a clerk and basically an office person. And my friends who were working in law firms, when the Xerox machine would break down, I'd be complaining about it. And they say, can't you have an office person fix it? And I'd have to say, you don't understand, I am the office person. So I did that. Some version of that for about 2.5 years. And then I got promoted to be a reporter. And I went through the usual stations of the cross of reporters in those days, 40 years ago, covering local beats, the police, city hall, state and local politics. And ultimately I went to Washington to cover the New York regional politicians in Washington, and eventually covered the White House. Then was sent out here to be the bureau chief in Los Angeles, went back to Washington. And after 23 years at the paper, when I was turning 46, so it was half my biological life and all of my professional life, Vanity Fair magazine, whose editor I had known, came along and offered me a job as a magazine writer. And I decided if I was going to really ever try something new, I ought to do that. And it was a very fulfilling experience. It's the difference between, in newspapers, the stories are all told in an art. I don't know if any of you are journalism majors, but it's all told in a very artificial way, with crammed with the most important facts, so-called, at the beginning of the story. And who, what, when, why. But it's a very unnatural way of telling a story. No one would say, in telling a story at the dinner table, 3 travelers bound for the Emerald City were stopped by a wicked witch today. It would be a long time ago. I was walking down the Yellow Brick Road and suddenly it started to rain. And so as a magazine writer, you had the chance to tell stories in that way, and it was very satisfying. And I wrote a lot of local profiles of people like John McCain and Barack Obama before he became president. And then after about a dozen years of doing that, Politico came along and asked me if I'd like to divide my time with them, which I did for a while. And then eventually The Atlantic asked me to come work for them. And during the pandemic, they had a big staff contraction, and I was one of the casualties of that. Meantime, I've written a couple of books, most recently far afield from my usual beat of politics, a book about Rodgers and Hammerstein, the creators of The Sound of Music and so many other musicals. And anyway, I'd like to say that I became a journalist because I had a burning desire to right social wrongs or uncover wrongdoing. And I have done some of that, I guess. But if I'm honest, it was because I didn't know what else I wanted to be when I grew up. And it was a way to avoid having to decide, because as a journalist, you get to be a doctor one day and a lawyer the next day. And you have all different hats that you can wear. And there's an element of it that is still very satisfying, which is to be able to run down the street and say, you won't believe what I heard today to your neighbors. And one of the convictions I've had over time is that you really can't make up what happens in real life. So I don't see why anyone would ever twist the facts or tell anything other than the truth, because the truth is really quite interesting. And secondly, the older I get, the more I do it, the questions are more interesting than the answers, because the answers vary and are uncertain, and we're groping blindly to try to find them. But the questions are the important thing to keep asking. And my experience so far in 3 semesters at USC is that people of your generation are very good at the questions, and I hope you keep it up.
Yeah, I wanted to ask very quickly about mentors. How important have mentors been in your journey, and how do students go about finding mentors in their chosen career path? And I'll start with Amy as well.
Hugely important. In fact, the last few years, I've been trying to actively develop my own kind of personal board of mentors or board of directors too, with different roles. Like, I feel like I need the cheerleaders, the people that will support me no matter what, that I can call and complain or whatever, and they're just there for me. Or mentors who are willing to coach and offer you critical feedback. And then like more sponsors, the folks that open up doors. You like, for example. And so I've kind of been actively like thinking, and people shift and change. And sometimes I tell people what I think they are to me, and sometimes it's just a little thing in my brain where I know that they're my cheerleader. In the cheerleader category right now, I've just, 20 years of working with people who've lived through awful circumstances. I find so amazing. I work with a group of advocates, so women who experience homelessness, most of them gender-based violence and lots of stuff. And now they're advocates and they're doing policy work, and I just feel really connected to them and so supported. And yeah, so that just feels more important. The proximity, like you're doing work like everyone up here has, and maybe you're involved in, like having the proximity to those most impacted by the issue you're trying to improve. I've just had so many amazing professors and colleagues. I've done a lot of professional development programs recently, and just find that I love those types of environments where you build connection with peers. I'm speaking this Friday at a Coro luncheon. The Coro program has been incredibly impactful in my life in terms of opening up networks and the training around that, but now the opportunities to have a bigger audience. And that my experience with the Coro program just keeps on giving and giving and giving. They have the Coro Fellows program, which is great for recent graduates of undergrad. You asked, how do you go about? Just ask, right? I mean, I guess someone could say no, but okay, then that's not a good mentor. Anyway, the core program teaches you to ask for a lot of feedback. And I found that no one has said no if I reach out and say, can I have 20 minutes of your time? I'm really just kind of growing my professional skills right now, and I love your feedback. And people, look at us, we're here rambling out about our whole career. Like, people like to talk about themselves. And to, come prepared with a few questions. Like, where do you see my leadership strengths? Where do you see my areas for growth? You know, whatever your particular questions are. People enjoy that.
That's such an important point. And Todd, you mentioned about quick questions coming from USC students in the 3 semesters here. And you were talking about asking. It's something people really don't appreciate, how important it is, whether it's asking for help of any kind, but not being afraid to appear uninformed or silly or stupid or whatever. You learn by asking the right people, and those people usually turn out to be some of your best mentors because they do like to be asked. Amy is so right about the importance of mentors. I can think of nothing more important to the evolution, to the development of my professional life. I think I mentioned briefly, got a little bit of a head up because Katie at dinner a few weeks ago said, "Who do you think your best mentors were?" So I've answered some of this already. But my first mentor was right out of the Army in Chicago law. And as I said before, Senator Edward W. Brooke, who was the first Black elected senator in our nation's history and a legendary civil rights icon. So you know where a lot of my substantive civil rights background first came from. And his introduction of me to so much of the civil rights community, which of course helped get my next job. He was the person who taught me the legislative process, and how you build coalitions and try to achieve consensus. Talk about values and how in this environment that you all are in, that we're all in, about civility. And you can disagree without being disagreeable, something that's not something we hear too often these days. But he steered me in the right direction and never ever refused a request to meet with him and ask him questions. Another legislative mentor in a similar but very different way was Senator Ted Kennedy, who I worked with for about 35 years, not for him, but with him. When I was with Senator Brooke, we were right down in the hall from him, along with Joe Biden. And when he was the chair of Judiciary, when he was really in the second half of his career, which might have been the best 20 years any senator's ever had. His first 20 were not too bad, but those last 20, and to be able to be with him side by side as we, all of us strengthened all the major civil rights laws during Reagan Bush and be working in the Supreme Court nomination. It was an incredible education. I gave you a hint before about that statement of fact about who I was and what the heck was I doing about to take over the Civil Rights Coalition's lobbying responsibilities. And that were all of the leaders of the women's community, the disability community, the minority community, labor community, who taught me a heck of a lot. I was naive, not the best word, but it's fairly accurate in terms of someone who'd gone to the all-male military high school academy, all-male at that time, Notre Dame, University of Chicago was quite different. But I was naive in a lot of ways. We hear a lot about white privilege and where zip code we were all born in and the different experiences. But I had to learn a lot about those experiences through their stories. Sometimes delivered in this kind of situation, other times chewing at me out as I made mistakes and wasn't inclusive enough in terms of decision making or who was at the table and that type of thing. Norman Lear, I mentioned, something that's very USC-ish, and that is the importance of the arts and culture and entertainment. I learned the nuts and bolts of legislation, how to forge coalition compromises, draft legislation, but I never fully appreciated my 8 years with Norman Lear that you got to be a storyteller. You got to be able to paint the picture. You got to have people listen to you. You might be the smartest person in the world, but you got to you kind of tell, you may know Dan Pink also.
Sure.
Dan Pink interviewed me in law school about civil rights work, and we stayed in touch. He wrote one of many good books on the New York Times bestsellers, but one of them was "To Sell is Human." And I think one lesson to always remember, because you all are many times going to be the smartest person in the room in your professional life and personal life, is to be able to persuade people. If you can't not only educate them, but have them remember what you're saying, making them feel comfortable with it. Norman Lear is a genius, not just because of the TV programs and the movies and everything else. So I have been, and Mary Frances Berry, who some of you might know, former chair of the Civil Rights Commission, a Black civil rights leader, who in the gentlest, if that was adequate, sometimes firmer, really got to the nuts and bolts of some of the more difficult aspects of civil rights history and civil rights work. So as I said at the very beginning, I'm grateful for how fortunate I have been for the career, but also because of the mentors.
I've had a lot of mentors who were important to me and very generous. And of course, as a journalist, you depend all the time, in Tennessee Williams's phrase, on the kindness of strangers, because you introduce yourself to people you've never met and expect that they'll tell you, in some cases, their deepest fears or secrets or desires or triumphs. In college, I had a wonderful visiting professor who was a retired journalist named Robert Donovan, and he had been the Washington bureau chief of the Los Angeles Times. And he had been a journalist dating back to the days of Mayor LaGuardia in New York, and he covered President Truman. And at that point, he was retired and was writing what became a definitive 2-volume work about the Truman presidency. And he was charming and good-humored and very funny and very kind, and made me think that there was a life to be had in journalism, and you could be a decent person. When I got to the New York Times, it was often a cold and very difficult place to be, and it wasn't full of a lot of generous people, but one person who was extremely generous to me and supportive was the columnist and now novelist Anna Quinlan, who, when I was having a sort of tryout to see if I could become a reporter, was in charge of the city desk, metropolitan desk that summer, and she gave me good stories and quietly expressed confidence in me and I'm sure she talked me up to the higher ups, although she has always disclaimed any particular responsibility for helping me, but I certainly felt helped by her. And then as time went on, I think what both Ralph and Amy said, you have to, there's a sociology of journalism that holds that some people become journalists because they are in fact introverts and rather shy people, and putting your press hat on gives you license to ask people how much money they make or when they stop beating their wife or whatever the question is. And you can live a kind of fantasy life with and I realized that in a cocktail party or social gathering, my default posture is often to start interviewing somebody instead of really talking to them. But so you have to be not ashamed or not afraid to ask people, because people like to be asked. And one of the truisms of journalism is most people, unless they're on 60 Minutes hiding wrongdoing and running through the parking lot, most people like to tell their own story because they're proud to tell it and share it. But you have to be willing to ask people for help, and most people will be delighted to hear it. And most people are honored to have the chance to pass on something that they've learned. In Washington, I had a mentor in a very colorful figure named R.W. Apple Jr., who was the Washington bureau chief of the New York Times. He was known as Johnny Apple because he was from Ohio, and there was a sort of Johnny Appleseed connotation there. And he was a truly larger, in some ways the last of the larger-than-life national journalists. And he would not fare too well today in some ways because he could be very short-tempered. And a particular flaw was that he was short-tempered with little people, not generals. He was short-tempered with the privates. But he was very generous to me and gave me good assignments and support. And I think, just to repeat what Amy and Ralph said, you have to raise your hand and ask, and quite often it will be granted.
Yeah, thank you. I definitely agree with that. I think there are places I wouldn't be if I didn't just ask the questions. So
and there's the classic saying, don't be afraid to ask dumb questions. They're easier to handle than mistakes. And there was a crusty old reporter when I was at the Times. I had a year in the business section, And I went to him one day because there were all these terms that I didn't understand about Wall Street and buying and bonds. And it was, and he said, don't worry, you'll learn it. And he told the story about when he was the young reporter, he would go to a news conference and the person would speak in this jargon and he didn't understand it at all. So finally he raised his hand to say, excuse me, could you explain what you meant by that? And he noticed that every other reporter in the room immediately began writing down the answer, and they didn't know either, but they were afraid to say. So he'd been brave enough to say that he didn't know.
Yeah. I want to open this up to the students because I know that you all have questions. Ben and I have more, but I want you to be able to ask yours. So just raise your hand and I'll point to you and you can ask questions. And it could be of all three of them, of one of them.
My first question is to you, Professor Turk. You know, it's very interesting. I think what you did first of all is very admirable. So I applaud you for that. Trying to take care of what is a huge problem in our city that I've grown up in that I love. But in your capacity, you have to sort of balance so many things. I'm sure there's so much that you wanted that you can't. So how do you prioritize, how do you sort of triage and deal with the disappointment that some may have because they have larger expectations? And doing that, I'm sure takes an emotional toll because there's so much that you see and you want to fix, but there's only so much that can be done. So how do you make those decisions?
That's tough because there's 60,000 people who are living under the rain tonight, right? And to not like catastrophize that in my brain. When I do that, I'm a terribly ineffective leader. But what I try to do is do at least something that I know is moving the needle each day. So if I'm looking at like priorities for the day, is it making sure we get this $20 million grant, for example, or is it, I don't know, having coffee with someone that we serve? Like, what is the most important way to move the needle? And if I feel like I've done that, then I feel I can usually sleep okay. But like, yeah, constantly just trying to do what we can do as strategically and wisely as possible. But it's not hard. I mean, it's not easy by any means, given the so many different things that could be so much better in our world, regardless of, pick an issue. And then staying, like, I just really do feel drawn to the direct service component, even though I do the administrative side. I couldn't do that if I was, at an office building away from the proximity of who we're serving, and without those relationships really inspire me. And I've brought many people who've used our programs to my class, and trying to create environments where there's more mutuality. So, again, I guess I'm sort of serving as a mentor role in that space for people that have used our programs, to introduce them to you all, and but vice versa, to have that really amazing relationship develop in the classes. And cool. I wish I knew like a really good answer.
That was a
Solution
great
to that
answer.
really
Yes,
good question.
Really good.
More questions? And you're just being shy. Everyone has one. I've made you come prepared. Courtney?
I have a question right now.
Anyone? Yeah. Thanks, Chelsea.
Hi, I'm Chelsea. I had a question about knowing when to take opportunities and when to say yes and knowing when to say no, because as we get older and get opportunities, there are so many options. How do we know which direction to go and how to best use our time?
Well, the older I get, I think I have to be, I've tried to be more willing to say yes when things come along. Because in the beginning, I think I was afraid sometimes, and I said no, or I didn't think imaginatively outside the little track I was on. I've never had a 5-year plan. I've never had a 10-year plan. I never sat down and thought about where I wanted to be when, and maybe that's a deficit. But I think so much of my career has been, and I think both of you have in some ways acknowledged it too, serendipitous. Things came along when you least expected them, and it worked out. But I think, E.B. White, who wrote Charlotte's Web, he wrote a famous essay about New York in the late 1940s, and he was describing the hustle bustle of New York and the tremendous sense of potential. And he had this wonderful line, which I often cite, which is that no one should come to New York to live unless he is willing to be lucky. And the notion that you can be willfully lucky and take yes for an answer and jump when someone gives you the chance. That's been a hard lesson for me to learn, and I think it's a good thing to keep in mind. And also that nothing is forever. You guys are quite lucky. Ralph's a little bit older than I am. I'm a lot older than Amy. And when I was starting, the assumption was when I went to work at the New York Times that I'd still be there, and I'd be there for my whole life and maybe 40 years. And I decidedly do not think that is the assumption in the workplace today, that you'll be at any one, IBM or General Motors or Starbucks for your life. And so you have societal backup and affirmation to, not flip from thing to thing aimlessly, but you have a tremendous amount of peer and other support to explore different careers at different times and be open to the possibilities that come.
I'd like to, it's getting a little personal, but build upon what you two just shared in terms of prioritization and how Tara asked about how you make all these decisions. Saying no, it's a very hard thing to learn, especially when starting out. I mentioned during the course of my first statement of response about asking for help and asking questions. And I told you about Young Brad. The second time it was happening, I didn't know that it was going to be happening, but I got into a situation where I couldn't sleep. Like some of you perhaps, I didn't know it, but I had anticipatory anxiety all my life, which is why when I couldn't sleep for the first time in my life at age 71, I went to a therapist who was the person who changed me in the hospital. And I learned how to reach out for help. And we talked about purpose, obviously, I've already told you about that. But he said, you sent me too. You gotta learn how to say no. You've got to learn how to say no. And those questions go to the heart, I think, of our lives. And the frustration I feel on a daily basis that I'm not getting to what I should get to. And not learning the lessons of some of those mentors, that a lot of it is incremental. You try to get something solid done by the end of the day, or several things done. And you don't get down on yourself, and you're not to the situation where it can damage not only yourself, but your wife or your child. It's really tough stuff. And Todd was definitely right. The questions you have asked in the first few minutes of asking them go right to the heart, I think, of all of our lives and what we try to learn from those people who ask for help.
And I guess I'd just say, Ralph is right. It's important to say, it's just as important to know when to say no as it is to say yes. But it's most important, I think, to be able to be kind to yourself and don't be your own toughest critic. And I think I've spent a lot of my life wasting time doing that.
Amen.
Hi, I'm Sam. And my question is, so you all have expressed that you started in places in your career where you were more directly interacting with local communities and people more one-on-one, and then you've all moved to places where you're slightly separated from that. And I wonder if you've ever regretted moving away from working so closely with people, and if being in a higher role has been a greater purpose or maybe not.
Yeah. Oh, I play that question in my brain every day. And my retirement job dream is to go back to the direct service. Well, and try to be of best service in the opportunity that I have now, which of course serves me in lots of levels. Yeah, I miss it. I miss the direct, I was a case manager. I really miss that. I don't know, it's a really good question. And I think some people really are the doers, the direct. I mean, my husband is a doer. He's a scientist that put him in a management role and there's no happiness at all, but he's just directly doing it. So kind of knowing the doer or the project manager or something is something that I think people kind of need to figure out. We so often promote our best doers in the work environment, and then they're just really not happy managing people, or maybe not even all that skilled at it yet too, just because you're so good at the doing part. doesn't necessarily translate to management without good training and mentorship.
I made up my mind pretty early that I didn't want to be a boss because I looked at the people who became editors who, as Amy said, were quite often the best journalists, best reporters. And the two skills are often quite contradictory. I mean, reporters are loners and anti-authoritarian, and they prowl around the edges of things, and bosses have to be responsible and manage the budget and deal with complaints. And so often these people were A, not very good at it, and B, very unhappy trying to do it. And they wish they were back, covering the war or the election or whatever. So I made up my mind that I always wanted to stay a reporter. And I have, but I do miss more immediate contact. And I think one of the things that I don't want to sound like an old curmudgeon, but one of the things that I think is something that many journalists miss today, they miss out on, and it affects their coverage later on, is being part of a community and having to see the people they cover the next day in the grocery store. If you've covered the city council meeting and you have to see the person that you wrote something about, it's pretty good for you to have that human interaction, because it just makes you a little humbler about what kind of, And Sam Rayburn, the Speaker of the House, when President Kennedy was president, hired all these brilliant people around him. Sam Rayburn said, "I know they're very smart, but I feel a lot better if any of them had ever run for sheriff." And I feel sometimes that way about younger journalists today, that it would be great if they had to cover the police or the school board or cover a fire. And particularly if they'd had to live in a community and then see the people they wrote about the next day at a human level. And that's true in politics too now, Ralph, because members of Congress don't really live in Washington with their families. They don't see each other in school or social settings. And it's become a kind of cliche that's almost tiresome, but it's also really true that I think members of Congress particularly don't know each other as individuals the way they did.
Absolutely. Sam, I think you heard a little bit of this earlier today. A little bit different from age 17. I wanted to be the United States Senator. I knew what I wanted to be. And for me, the first thing was to try to get the requisite education, and fortunate enough to be at Notre Dame and in Chicago, and in the Army, and Senator Brooke. And the more I was with Senator Brooke and Senator Kennedy, I wanted really to do it. And a number of times, some of my mentors said, "Don't stay in Washington. You've done your stuff. You've got to find a place." I think it was Ken Heck from West Virginia. Studied all the congressional districts and moved to the place where he thought he would have the best chance. That's what Joe Rao and all these people were saying. So I had a general plan. And I think I mentioned the Nancy Pelosi LBJ library interview last Friday night. And I think she was focusing mainly on younger women, but I think it applies to anyone. I talked about purpose. She talked about will, what you wanted to do, and to have some kind of plan on how to get there. And there's really nothing like a rigid plan. You've got to be pretty flexible. And I learned early on that the best strategy, and this is probably good for you all, and you probably already employed it, and that is those initial jobs, this goes to mentorship and other things, make yourself indispensable. It's the time of your life, and by the way, you have to make sure you take care of your financial needs and making sure you're independent enough to be able to make decisions, not just based on money, but be in a situation where people do know you, they really do want to be your mentors, that this young woman is a go-getter, and you become either a protege or you're introduced to other people, and you keep on building on that. Some of you, I know you've heard this several times, and certainly Ara has, of all the lessons I have learned that I haven't already shared, personal relationships built on trust, whether it's the people that Todd was talking about at the times, or Amy and I have talked about, whether it's in my personal life or whether it has been in my professional life. 90% of the success, I think, has been building personal relationships built on trust over time, not just with mentors and friends and family, but your adversaries. In some ways, a lot of my career depended on being able to work with some of the more right-wing members of the House and the Senate or a presidential administration. And as one adversary said, we hated you on the one hand, but when you struck a deal with us, you kept to it and you never made it personal. You never burned the bridges, even when you were yelling from the top of the New York Times, criticizing H.W. Bush or Ronald Reagan. But I think there's no perfect answer here. And there are times when I wish that I had gone back to Illinois rather than the Montgomery County, Maryland, and run for office against a 7-8 term incumbent who was very, very popular. But that was even a good experience. It led to my next job. It's that old door closes, one opens that happens to all of us.
Thank you.
Another question? One more.
So I wanted to direct this question to you because of your experience with bipartisanship. What do you think of the state of bipartisanship today versus when you were lobbying? And do you think that the two-party system is going to continue to be compatible with our system of government if the trend of polarization continues?
Great question. 5 or 6 years ago, before I said I was getting advice, I wanted to write a book like Todd Purdum. And I called Taylor Branch, who's a friend, and of course, one hell of a author, especially on Martin Luther King. He said, I've always wondered how you guys did all of those strengthening the Voting Rights Act, the Americans with Disability Act, for fair housing, but you can't just make it about what you did primarily in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, because the world has changed. The Republican you were, the Lionel that I was, and all those other Republicans, they're not around anymore. So you've got to do something that will be in part a prescription for how to get back to some kind of stability and the willingness and the experience and bringing people together to get things done in the Senate, the House, or anywhere. Because this is pretty much a very national problem, not worldwide problem. I wrote Todd's seen it, and a couple of others have seen it, with one of my former bosses, David Dornsife, who's a moderate Republican. And it was ostensibly in praise of Bob Dole's life. And he was a conservative Republican who, on equal opportunity issues, especially voting rights issues, terrific record. Through the 60s, 70s, 80s, I had a chance to work out compromises that passed 85-8 in the Senate. John Roberts was the leader of the effort against that, and he eventually won, at least temporarily, in the Supreme Court. It was the Shelby case on voting rights, and the case on Section 2. I'm getting too technical here, but what I said at the end, and it was a last-minute addition, was I'm still committed to bipartisanship. It worked well for a long time, but bipartisanship is a means to an end. The end is making democracy work. And we don't have bipartisanship anymore. We don't have two parties that are pro-democracy or tell the truth, don't spread disinformation. I used a phrase for the first time, our event this morning, with Joe Trippi. We were talking about bipartisanship, and the classes have always said, what about independent parties and people who are not Republicans and Democrats? One reason I favor ranked choice voting among many others. But cross-partisan, I think, is what we're talking about now. And Joe has just put together something called the Union, which is a project of the Lincoln Project, which I think has rehabilitated itself in the last 8 or 10 months. One reason bringing Joe Trippi on, but to get independents and Republicans and Democrats, not just never Trumpers, to work together for 2022 and 2024. And I said, cross-partisan, right? He said, basically what you're inferring or what you're stating It's not the same. I hope we can get back to it. But if we're going to get back to bipartisanship, I swear the only way will be first the collapse of this current Republican Party. That's the only way it's going to happen. And my gut is if ranked choice voting, which is now passed in the red state, Alaska, and Maine, New York City, and 36 other municipalities, including 5 or 6 in California, there's going to be very different ways, because that depends on people reaching out to a broader swath of the voting population and being willing to work with the other sides, get things done, and not just be so vitriolic and spend $1 billion to destroy something.
The one thing I forgot to say a minute ago, Sam, and not to again to sound like a hopeless old fart, but there's a great old pop song by Neas called "I Miss the Hungry Years," and
I
think,
like that song.
and you all are in the years that may not seem hungry to you, but and again, I know that you're all living your lives to the fullest now, or at least I hope you are. But I do look back on the earliest parts of my career with enormous affection and think how lucky I was to have, and if I knew then what I know now, how much more I would have, appreciated it. But I think be open to the excitement of doing things for the first time, and the first time you work on a campaign, or the first time you get a job in a challenging environment, or the first time you write a legal brief, or whatever it is. Savor those experiences while they're happening, however tired you are, because they are what later years will teach you and sustain you in a very meaningful way that you'll remember them with fondness, I hope, and sometimes with regret. But
Sam, you asked me the best question at our pizza and politics lunch today. Something we all deal with. Dispiriting is a mild way of describing what we've been going through, especially with the pandemic and democracy and Ukraine situation, and so many other things. And I don't want to paraphrase even what you were saying, but Holly was my daughter, was 22, and I think you said you were 21 or 22. We're talking about hope and confidence in the future, and hanging in there. What's the use? And I'm not quoting it, but the general feeling that I think we all experience. And I came up with a couple of thoughts that I learned early on, and I repeat them to myself all the time. And one was when John Sears, who Todd probably knew, was a campaign manager for Ronald Reagan and for Richard Nixon for a while anyway. And he wanted me to go with him rather than me going with the leadership conference. But then when he saw the air service office offer, as you will remember from this morning, he said, go with the leadership conference on civil rights, because you'll have the opportunity to be on the front lines of history. And we'll be opposing on almost every issue, but you want to be involved. And whether that is a homelessness shelter or organization or anything that you all are interested in at the city level or village level or county, state, national, that's exciting to be able to make that kind of difference. And then that great Oliver Wendell Holmes quote that I also shared with you this morning, to live fully is to be engaged in the passions of one's life. You've got passions now, and you got many more coming, and you want to be part of that and to live a full life.
Thank you. I wasn't asking more question, but I feel like that's a great way to finish up today. So we can thank our fellows very much for this experience with us. Thank you.